Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the NCI webinar, Modular R01s in Cancer Control and Population Sciences. I'm Jennifer Leidenberger, and I will be your WebEx host. Before introducing our speaker today, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. All these will be in listen-only mode. Please your questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A or chat panel and select all panelists from the drop-down. We ask them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Specific aims will not be addressed during the webinar. If you need live closed captioning, please refer to the Media Viewer panel in the right-hand section of your screen. This is being recorded and will be posted online in the near future. I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter, Scott Rogers.
Everyone, I too would like to thank you for joining us for this webinar on Modular R01s in the Cancer Control and Population Sciences. Scott Rogers, I'm a public health advisor in the epidemiology and genomics research program. I'm also the contact for this FOA. I'll be starting us off today, but before I do, I'd like to introduce the other presenters from the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences. So today are Drs. Lee Zhu and Denise Lewis from the Surveillance Research Program, Dr. Stephanie Nelson from our Epidemiology and Genomics Research Program, Larry Schools in our Behavioral Research Program, Dr. Ann Geiger in our Healthcare Delivery Research Program. So, what's our agenda today? We're going to start off with the purpose of the announcement. I'm going to describe the Modular R01 because not everyone is familiar with this mechanism. I'll be providing you with information on the application process, who is eligible to apply, the study dates, a bit review, and then we'll delve into the scientific areas of emphasis covered under this announcement. And we'll leave time for questions at the end. So, we'll release an announcement that uses the Modular R01 mechanism. As you know, competition for research funding has grown increasingly more challenging. As the grants continues to increase, both scientists and policymakers are concerned about the challenges investigators face, including the length of time it takes to achieve a first R01 award. Among those challenges is the unprecedented number of applicants competing for a limited funding pool. So the purpose of this announcement is to list that applications for research studies in population sciences can be accomplished in 5 years or less with the budget cap of the Modular R01 mechanism. So, is the Modular R01? It's not a new mechanism to NCI. It's a mechanism that's been used successfully by the basic sciences for years, but it's not been widely used by investigators in the population sciences. The Modular R01 is similar to the traditional R01 with one key difference. The budget capped at $250,000 direct costs per year. This one was designed to streamline the application process, getting the attention of investigators, their institutions, peers, and NIH staff on science rather than budget details. Under the Modular R01, investigators have the opportunity to use the Modular R01 forms, which require categorical breakdown of costs, while investigators are required to provide a budget narrative for personnel that include a description of personnel effort and roles. This narrative is usually not required for other cost categories. Like the R01 mechanism, investigators should have, and we strongly recommend, data that supports the proposed research aims. I also want to mention that the application format for the Modular R01 is similar to that of the traditional R01, except for the budget pages. That means you have to follow the page limits and application sections that would be similar to the traditional R01. Please review the FOA for announcement-specific instructions. More points on the Modular R01. Modular R01 funding decisions do follow the NCI's R01 pay line. Applications that receive a percentile that falls outside the R01 pay line, program staff will follow NCI's exception process, considering scientific merits of the study, whether the proposed research addresses programmatic priority areas and scientific gaps in the NCI portfolio. When did, and this is one advantage of this mechanism, is that Modular R01s receive significantly reduced policy cuts compared to the traditional R01. Similar to the traditional R01, early investigators who are awarded a Modular R01 are eligible for 2 additional years of funding on NCI's recently released policy notice, merit awards for early-stage investigators. For example, if a state investigator submits an R01 application with a 3-year project period, it could be funded for up to 5 years under this policy. Lastly, we are not going to discuss other funding mechanisms today. I do mention, however, this mechanism is not meant to replace the R21 or R03 mechanisms. Rather, the modular R01 provides another option for investigators who are considering a smaller scale study that would require more time for a larger budget than is allowed under the R21, R03. As I mentioned earlier, applicants can request up to $250,000 direct costs per year, and when determining whether proposed direct costs fall within the modular R01 budget cap, and subaward FNAs need to be excluded. It allows for project periods of 2 to 5 years. However, NCI encourages projects of shorter duration. With a funding pool, in cases of funding exceptions, the duration study is often taken into consideration. We are saying through this announcement that investigators must submit their R01 studies as a modular R01. If it is more appropriate as a traditional R01, then that is the mechanism should be used, and investigators should submit through an announcement that supports the traditional R01. The cost in the project period must reflect the needs of the proposed project. So who is eligible to apply? We've received a number of questions on this announcement. If whether this announcement is limited to or intended for early investigators. The announcement is open to all extramural investigators performing research in the population sciences. The announcement does encourage early stage investigators to apply because NCI and DCCPS are working to provide more funding opportunities for early stage investigators, and we feel that the modular R01 is one option for investigators who are in a career and not have access to the resources, staff, or preliminary data needed for the larger traditional R01. The announcement is open to investigators from both domestic and foreign institutions. In this announcement, applicants can submit new and competing renewal applications, readmissions, even if the initial A0 submission was submitted to a different PA or PAR, and will accept competitive revisions, also known as competing supplements. The other speakers today will be presenting on the research topics covered under this announcement, and go into each of the scientific areas listed here. I do want to mention that this announcement promotes a diversity of research topics in the population sciences that lend themselves to a shorter time span and reduced budget. After the webinar, if you have questions on whether a proposal you're developing would be responsive to the announcement, please feel free to contact me or a program director in DCCPS, and you can often find program directors and their expertise on the DCCPS web pages. Shown here summarizes the receipt, review, and award dates for this PAR. You'll notice that the announcement has 2 receipt dates per fiscal year, one in November and one in March. And by the way, you have coming up fairly quickly on November 7th. This is the first issuance of this announcement. If we get good response with a significant number of applications, adding to 3 receipt dates per year and issuance is a possibility for NCI to consider. A frequent question that we've received is, will applications be reviewed in a PAR-specific emphasis panel? All applications will be reviewed in the Center for Scientific Review standing study sections and corresponding member conflict panels where relevant review expertise already exists. PAR does not have a special review. Applications will be reviewed using the standard review criteria for R01s. You can find this review criteria in the funding opportunity announcement. Now, for applications proposing a clinical trial, follow the specific options for clinical trials. So moving on to Dr. Li Zhu and Denise Lewis, who are describing some of the scientific areas supported through the surveillance research program.
Hi, my name is Dr. Denise Lewis, and I'm an epidemiologist in the surveillance research program. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Li Zhu, who is a statistician in the same program. Briefly, I want to cover our mission in the surveillance research program. Provide national leadership in the science of cancer surveillance, as well as analytical tools and methodological expertise in collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and disseminating reliable population-based cancer statistics. This is the bulk of what we do. but also I want to point out that we house the Surveillance, Epidemiology, and End Results, or SEER program, which is a collection of population-based cancer registry data from state and local registries. So we're following the topic areas that were in the announcement that you probably saw. First, I want to point out that we have a considerable amount of work that we fund and that we conduct ourselves in the statistical and analytical methods area. Specifically, we are interested in modeling, looking at screening, diagnosis, treatment, prevention, outcome, biomarkers, and prognosis, and also spatial, that's more for cancer mapping and high-dimensional data, including areas of uncertainty. We had a recent FOA that we just concluded on in that topic area. Also, complex factors in the cancer outcome follow-up period. The first bullet has a lot in it, and we could break this down further, but because of our constraints, it's sort of there. The next two areas are applied informatics methods for cancer surveillance, and then using trends in cancer survival estimates to inform cancer control. And these are, frankly, two areas that are very new to our program. We really haven't funded a lot of research so far in these areas, so I want to put a little more emphasis on these two areas. And so for the applied informatics, we're looking for expanding data linkages to improve data collection, evaluation, natural language processing to automate information processing. And this is a really critical emphasis that we have now in the SEER program to cut down on report delays, and hopefully we're going to speed up the issuance of our data to the public for use. So this is very important to us. Also measuring technology dispersion to evaluate health disparities, which is an important area at the National Cancer Institute. And then using trends, we're seeking to measure survival trends over periods for various populations and evaluating survival outcome and recurrent events.
Okay, I'm Stephanie Nelson. I'm a program director in the epidemiology and genomics research program. And our program supports research in human populations to understand the determinants of cancer occurrence and outcomes, and to translate these findings to clinical and public health interventions. So I've broadly listed here the areas that EGRP supports, and these are also listed in more detail in the FOA. But for example, we support research in cancer survivorship, including exposures and behaviors that impact survivors' quality of life. Grants in environmental and genomic epidemiology, and genomic epidemiology includes genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, and metabolomics. We support the development of tools and methods to assess risk factors related to diet and physical activity. And we also have grants that examine the effects of cancer treatments. Next slide. So I listed here three grants that, three modular R01 grants that have been funded and are currently in the EGRP portfolio. For PIs who typically submit applications through our program, this mechanism provides opportunity to do distant or deeper analysis of your existing data, or to test an existing tool or assessment method in new populations. And I think you can take a look at these three grants, and you'll see that is what they do. They have some that they previously collected on, for example, pancreatic cancer incidence, and are mining that data to understand racial and ethnic disparity in incidence of this cancer. Similar for the third grant on breast cancer in Blacks, they also have existing data that they are using to look at the impact of these three parameters: genomics, healthcare use, and lifestyle on outcomes in this population. And our third grant takes an existing technology for assessing pain after surgery and is applying it to a specific population in Turkey. And
Okay. I'm Jerry Sauls. I'm a senior scientist in the behavioral research program. Before I talk about the particular topics of interest to the behavioral research program, I want to talk a bit about cancer survivorship. Infant cancer survivorship is across all areas and all programs of our division, and give you an idea of some of the questions that we're interested in, sometimes by a particular program, sometimes by several programs together. One is about risk stratification and the management of late effects of cancer and cancer treatment. Another has to do with looking at aging phenotypes in cancer survivors, because we know cancer tends to occur more among the aged or old adults. We're interested in hallmarks of aging, particularly aging biomarkers, and how they may be relevant to a wide range of cancer survivorship outcomes, morbidity, mortality, quality of life, etc. Clearly, observational and interventional studies are important for us of what the varying factors, clinical, genomic, lifestyle, that could influence the outcomes in particular among those who are living with cancer, and the effects it may have on their families. And also we're interested in what trends one sees in adolescents and young adult survivors, particularly with regard to treatment of specific cancers that go with high mortality. There's a variety of other topics that were covered. If you go to the websites of the different programs, branches, you'll see the particular topics that go into even detail. But this gives you an idea of the overall level of support and interest we have for topics in cancer survivorship that cross areas of control and population sciences. Now I'm going to speak more to what behavioral research program is particularly interested in. The first slide really covers a lot. I'm not going to cover all of this. Needless to say, one of the things the behavioral research program is interested in is cancer-related behaviors and biobehavioral risk factors. And that goes from behavioral genetics all the way through to adherence and tobacco use, and again, behaviors and adherence, for example, in cancer survivors. In terms of more specific topics, one of our interests is identifying the role of perceptual, cognitive, and psychological factors in cancer detection and diagnosis. This is most interested in how what factors and basic factors and applied factors influence how people read X-rays, how they read scans. And we're talking now about practitioners, radiologists, and others to identify tumors, for example. Are interested in factors that are biological, which are pathways through which certain psychosocial stressors, such as, say, early childhood adversity being one, influence cancer outcomes. So interested in identifying those pathways by psychosocial factors are relevant. Another thing that's dear to our hearts is assessing the cognitive effects following treatment for non-central nervous system malignancies, what is sometimes referred to as chemo fog or chemo brain. The program is very interested in health and all the different variations of social media. We have an emphasis on looking at observational studies and interventional studies that look at prevention strategies that are conveyed through those different media. Tobacco is also a major topic in our program. In particular, I'm emphasizing here the patterns and trends and the factors that influence the use of various kinds of tobacco products. And of course, there's very large input right now with regard to products that are alternatives and new and novel products, particularly that are being marketed to youth and adults. I'd be remiss not to talk about the role of health disparities. We're interested in differences among varying groups, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, and how they may differ in behavioral risk factors, and that may be affecting a variety of things, including health care, and also end-of-life decision-making. So for quite a few topics, consider within the behavioral realm.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ann Geiger. I'm the Deputy Associate Director of the Healthcare Delivery Research Program. We are the newest of the 4 programs here in DCCPS, and here we have a conceptual figure of how we think about our work. So we are really all about improving the delivery of cancer-related care and ultimately patient outcomes. We have 3 subgroups that have a focus but also work together very much with one another and with our colleagues in the division. So we are interested in patients. They're at the core. We are interested in improving patient experiences. We are interested in measuring health outcomes of a wide variety. About a circle, we have a health systems and interventions group. We are very, very interested in promoting interventions. We see this as an area that healthcare delivery research and health services research has not always moved into as much as it might. That group is also the group that helps us think about clinicians and delivery system factors that we may be able to intervene on to improve the patient experience and outcomes. And thirdly, we have the healthcare assessment research branch, which operates on more of a population level and thinks about things like utilization, access, and diffusion. We're not funded, in fact, we've funded only 1 modular R01 because we are a relatively new program. So we're actually very excited to have the opportunity to really seed our field with some of these smaller grants that probably will then lead to bigger projects down the line. So I'll go over a couple of topics of particular interest. And the first one is of the broadest interest, I think, to our program, and understanding patient, clinician, healthcare system, and community-level factors, and how they relate to access and to receipt of appropriate healthcare services. And we operate across the cancer continuum. We have a large portfolio of screening studies. We have a large portfolio of survivorship studies. We have many things that fall elsewhere on the continuum. As Jerry noted, we would be remiss not to mention our strong interest in underserved populations. And we are also very interested in delivery settings that are in the community as opposed to academic medical settings. And then just quickly, the last couple, we are interested in continuing to develop tools to capture patient-generated data, and even more so to figure out how to use that data to improve clinical care and outcomes. We're interested in enhancing patient-centered care, and you see there are a couple of ideas about how to do that. We are very, very interested in financial hardship. This is an area that has emerged very clearly the last few years, and I want to note that we include financial hardship. We include employment in that category. I mentioned already appropriate care. We are very interested in understanding why guideline-recommended care is overused or underused. And of course, with the emergence of precision medicine, there are many opportunities to take on topics that are emerging as opposed to things that have already happened. So with that, I am going to end by reminding everyone that Scott Rogers is the contact for this FOA, and I really encourage you to get in touch with him so he can direct your ideas toward the people who are best positioned to advise you. And I am going to return the webinar to Scott.
Okay, so we are moving into the questions portion of the webinar. We've already received a number of questions, so I go through some of these right now, and I will attempt to answer the ones that are more related to the administrative or logistics of the PAR. I will also be triaging questions to the other speakers in the room. So the first question, I have actually quite a few questions from on early stage investigators. Are early investigators who have never received an R01 encouraged to apply with a co-PI who is more senior, or apply on their own as a solo PI? First, if an early investigator applies and is funded through a modular R01, say more senior investigator, that application is actually considered an experienced investigator R01. So for an application to be considered an ESI or early stage investigator R01, all PIs on that application must be early stage investigators. So also a question about, are multiple PIs allowed on the Modular R01 application? Yes, we do allow multiple PIs on the Modular R01 application. There's another one here. Scrolling through these quickly. Modular, I already answered that one. I am sorry. Early stage investigator is awarded through the Modular R01 mechanism to lose their ESI status on a traditional R01. Yes. The Modular R01 and the traditional R01 are both R01 mechanisms. So if you are awarded through the Modular R01 mechanism, you would lose your ESI status. And if you apply for future R01s, you would be considered an experienced investigator R01. There's a question here about additional years of funding at no additional cost. I am actually going to split that into two questions. One being, the Modular R01, like any grant application at NIH, is open for cost extension at the end of the project period. So that would be your no-cost extension, and you would get additional years of funding at no additional cost. The question applies to the merit policy that I went over in the presentation. What is at the end of the project period that you are funded for, you would then, as an ESI, submit additional application pages for the extension period, and with those application pages, you would request a budget. So are funded for those additional years under that merit period. Just to confirm, the payments are the same for the standard R01. Yes, they are. I'm not going to get into the pay lines today because the pay lines are set each fiscal year, and since we are at the end of the FY18 fiscal year, we are still waiting to see what the FY19 fiscal year pay lines will be. Other cancers of interest for this funding opportunity. The bases of emphasis are very broad. I'll open this up to the other speakers, but I don't think that we are specifically targeting any cancers of interest. No. How are new investigators not having had an intern are considered from early stage investigators? Just to go over the definition of new investigator versus the early stage investigator, for those who don't know, an early stage investigator is an investigator who has never had an R01 or R01 equivalent, and they're within 10 years of their terminal research degree. Or a new investigator is an investigator who's outside that 10-year window, but also has never had an R01 or R01 equivalent. Currently, under the NIH Early Career Investigator Initiative, a higher priority is given to the early stage investigators. Funding and priorities for the new investigators, that would have to be a decision made at the NCI leadership level, so I don't think we'll get into that today. Elaborate on how the merit applies to the Modular R01. Merit policy, as I mentioned in my presentation, it is like a traditional R01 selected for funding as a stage investigator, and would consider adding 2 additional years to study at the end of the period that you've been awarded for. Say you are eligible because you have to be nominated. The early stage investigator does have to submit an application for those additional 2 years, and those 2 additional years have to be reviewed and approved by the National Cancer Advisory Group. How are merit applications reviewed? Excellent question. So at the project period for which you were awarded originally, program staff and leadership will see the progress on that period. They will also look at the application that the early stage investigator submits for those additional 2 years. They will then write a proposal NCI leadership which will be reviewed, which will take into account the earlier period as well as what's being proposed for the next 2 years. Those funding decisions have to be approved by the National Cancer Advisory Board. Is an application submitted to a different PR as an R01 can be submitted to the Modular R01 way. An application can be submitted as an R01, but it would have to be submitted as a new A0 application. You can't submit an R21 as an amended application using a mechanism.
And this is Anne, if I may. It's likely you would need to expand the scope of your R21 work slightly because that is a much lower budget and short project period time. So whatever you do, you want to make sure the scope of work is appropriate for the mechanism you're applying for.
What is the benefit of submitting to this mechanism versus a standard R01? Are the set-aside funds in a very different pay line? We discussed some of the benefits earlier, one being that you get a reduced policy cut. There are no set-aside funds. This is a PR mechanism, not an RFA or a PA with a set-aside. So these applications would be funded through the NCI pool. We are not using a different pay line for the modular R01 mechanism. Funding decisions will be made using the standard NCI pay lines for traditional R01 investigators and early stage investigators. For the policy regarding nominated additional 2 more years funding support, currently funded R01s be eligible. The policy was recently released this is the merit policy again for early stage investigators. It only applies to applications that are received by NCI in FY18 or later. So apply to applications submitted to this modular R01 way. Speak in more detail to the importance of preliminary data to this mechanism.
Mechanism does require preliminary data. In a sense, it follows the same R01 criteria. We would note, because there's the possibility here of a shorter time period, most R01s tend to be 5 years. Certainly this means that review panels will consider the scope of your work if it's a reduced number of years, and they may place somewhat less preliminary data in a different context for the reviewers than a standard 5-year R01. This is Jerry Souls.
The duration of the project is very important. Conduct projects in short period of time. Does that mean that proposing a 5-year project won't be as strong as a 3-year project? First of all, we would have to take into consideration the review. So review will often, mention in the summary statement whether or not they felt that the time period proposed for the application is appropriate for the work proposed. Now, if the application meets the funding pay line for NCI, obviously we would try and pay it under the pay line. If it comes to exception funding, we would take into consideration the duration of the project, and again, is it appropriate for the project proposed?
So this is Anne Geiger, and I think one of the things I would like to emphasize is there is at times an assumption that an R01 has to be 5 years long. Part of our intention with this announcement is to clearly indicate to all of you in the extramural community that we welcome applications that are of a shorter duration because the scope of work proposed is appropriate for that duration.
Studies conducted by U.S.-based PIs who would like to partner with collaborators at international sites to conduct research among populations abroad eligible to apply? Yes, they would be able to apply to this mechanism. The second part of this question is NCI primarily interested in, for instance, health services research in the U.S.?
Hi, this is Anne. That's a great question, and ultimately, I think the most important question is whether peer reviewers will find your work relevant and have public health impact. Unfortunately, probably mostly in the United States. So we all know the health services systems are very different in the U.S. versus other places. Sometimes comparisons of those approaches can be very informative for making changes to our system and improving care. So I will echo Jerry in saying that ultimately what matters is a very well thought out, very well justified scope of work and proposed aims that have the potential to have substantial public health impact. So certainly those types of applications are not excluded, but will be held to the same expectations and standards as would any application to this announcement.
Okay, another question, and they getting questions, so this is great, lots of enthusiasm. An emphasis on community settings was mentioned. Are there any things that reviewers will look for when considering the strength of a community partner or pre-academic partner?
This is Anne again, and I have a secondary role working in the NCI Community Oncology Research Program. It's been my experience in that context that what viewers look for is evidence of genuine collaboration. So to the extent you've already done some work with a community site or you have pilot data based on work with a community site, that will likely strengthen your application in terms of peer reviewers. But again, like many things, it's incumbent upon you as an applicant to make a convincing argument to peer reviewers.
Here's a question that was actually touched on in the presentation, but those who maybe entered the webinar late, I will answer this one. So will proposals be reviewed in the regular study section or in a particular one? This PAR, all applications will be reviewed by the Center of Scientific Review at the standing study sections or a corresponding member conflict panel. So we did not request a special emphasis panel for this PAR. I have a question regarding scope. Our traditional R01s, which are larger in scale, and other ones, for instance, pilots and preliminary studies, where does PAR fit? I think this is a very broad question, so I open it up to the group. As far as comparing it to the R01 mechanism, it's slightly different because the R01 mechanism is more of an exploratory, innovative study mechanism, whereas the Modular R01 mechanism, which you have preliminary data. So you've already moved beyond that exploratory phase. Compared to the more traditional R01, because of the budget cap on the Modular R01, you are limited in what you can propose. So it's fall in between. So you already have your preliminary data, you've moved beyond the exploratory phase, but be that next step before moving into a larger scale study that requires an additional budget.
This is Stephanie Nelson from Epidemiology and Genomics Research Program. I alluded to in my presentation that I think that you can also think of this mechanism as additional work you want to do after you've done your large study. I'm in the genomics and epidemiology branch, and we typically get requests for very large studies where you're going to genotype or collect data on many people. Maybe you've done that, and maybe you want to look a little deeper into your data, and it doesn't quite need the full 5 years funding of the typical R01, but mechanism might be a good opportunity for you to do some of that extra work and really get a lot out of the data that you worked so hard to collect.
This falls from the Behavioral Research Program. Another response to that question would be that one would imagine, certainly in applications I've seen. A 5-year might very well have an early observational phase followed by an intervention phase. And that would, in fact, require 5 years. It's a case where someone might imagine collecting the observational data 2-3-year period with the goal of then submitting an R01 based on those data to launch an intervention study. That would be a case where this would be appropriate.
And Ann Geiger, I'm going to follow on to that and Scott's example. You might have pilot data that are focused more on feasibility, will people sign up, can the intervention be delivered, that you do not have adequate sample size to show a benefit of an intervention. And so you can imagine a shorter period with a scope that's focused on demonstrating benefit of an intervention prior to then going out and getting a larger R01 to conduct an intervention. And the scenario that Jerry described, when you try to shove that all into one grant, that's a very fast timeline. And so you could get a modular R01, really focus on that first piece, and then go back and get a larger R01. You might actually be able to do the larger study in more places with more patients. So I think that's another example of how you might think about the modular R01. It's not pilot data, it's taking pilot data to the next level so that you can then go to a level after that.
This leads to, in comparison to what Stephanie just described, the large studies in genetic epidemiology, in statistics world, many of our R01s, existing funded R01s, are already modular R01. So in a statistical grant, if especially when existing data is already existing, we do not need to collect data. The budget is using the modular R01. So what I see here is the modular R01 is kind of a standard statistical R01.
Okay, more questions came in. Are ESIs still eligible for additional 2 years of funding if the modular R01 is awarded for a 5-year period? And under the merit policy, it does allow up to 7 years of funding for early stage investigators. So we would consider additional 2 years on top of the 5 years that you're awarded for. You give an example of what constitutes preliminary data for statistical methodology research.
As Denise presented on our slides, some 3 categories we talked about today. The first category is we have already have many successful R01 funded, and the users can find them using the keyword search, using just the listed keywords we listed in that category. You find some successful R01s, their PIs and abstract.
A new investigator who will be submitting with a co-PI with an ESI will be considered an ESI application. Nope, this would actually be considered an this would be considered a standard R01 application. I mentioned earlier, for it to be considered an ESI application, all the PIs listed must be in the early stage investigator status. More question that came in, and this might be a bit difficult, but we'll attempt to answer this. How much preliminary data is typically acceptable for an R01 application? And I personally would say that this might be something that the review would have to answer. Do they think the preliminary data is necessary, adequate for the aims proposed?
This is Ann Geiger again. I actually think this illustrates another point, which is the importance of talking with a program director here at NCI early on when you are starting to think about an application. We here at NCI see many applications that go to many different study sections, And we can probably, on a more individual level, help you think about. We don't make the decisions. We do not tell you what to do, but we can help you think through what amount of preliminary data might be appropriate for your application.
I want to reinforce that's on our experience at either or listening to reviews and seeing summary sheets. We do have some sense of when, on a particular problem, something looks like and was reacted to as if, yes, this is a critical amount of foundational data and feasibility, and other cases where, no, it's not. So the program officer is really the right person to ask that question.
And this is Ann again, and I should have prefaced my comment by saying that the answer is it depends. And that's why I suggest really reaching out to Scott as a point of contact and then getting engaged with someone here who, again, can help you think this through in a way that's specific to your aims and your context.
Thank you. If a senior investigator or many investigators listed on your grant as collaborators, co-investigators, consultants, not as PIs, and early-stage investigators submitting an application, is this an ESI R01? Yeah, it would be. Again, they would have to be PIs on the application for you to lose your ESI status on that application. Can submit a previously scored but not funded R01 to the November 6th read date. Again, under NIH policy, there cannot be two similar applications in the system at the same time. So you would have to have the summary statement for that previously funded R01. It has to be released before submitting the amended application for that R01 to the modular R01 FOA.
And this is Ann Geiger again. I'm going to reiterate that the scope of your previously reviewed R01 and a modular R01 would be expected to be different. And yes, they would probably be expected to be different if you had a larger budget in the original.
So context of expanding data linkages, mechanism be used to build data infrastructure that can be used to take a number of questions, disparate cancer, treatment, and outcomes, etc.
Denise Lewis, I think the answer to that question is yes. It'd be, and I'm thinking more of is that I was talking about previously with our applied informatics area where I mentioned expanding data linkages to improve data collection and evaluation. But it can be all sorts of applications to treatment that we're very interested in that could dovetail into other areas, I think, in perhaps Ann's group. I would say yes.
The appropriate ask to speak with program officer even before your research aims are finalized, or program officers prefer that we wait until we have a complete set of potential aims to discuss.
This is Stephanie, EGRP, and I personally think it's fine to contact your program officer even if you don't quite have the aims firmly established. We're happy to talk to you. And I'd like to add, for people who might be new to contacting program officers at NCI and NIH, don't worry too much about the specific person you contact, that they have the right expertise, because we'll talk to each other. We'll get you to the right person with the right expertise.
And I will say, for me personally and for some of the people I work with, it's helpful to have something written down. Say, because it forces you to put some thought into it. It also gives us something to react to. I can only speak for myself, but it's much easier for me to give what I believe is helpful advice when I can look at something in front of me and respond specifically to it. And there are some nodding heads in the room here, so that may be a common theme.
This is Terry Sauls. I like to see a specific aims page though the investigator could say, preface sending it with the tentative. That's fine, but yeah, something on paper is helpful for us to be able to respond to. And we do that.
Okay, it looks like we are slowing down as far as questions. So if you have additional questions, you can always contact me, Scott Rogers, and I will reach out to the program director in DCPS who has the contact expertise to help you, or I will, if the question is related to the announcement itself, I can certainly respond to those questions. So I would say please feel free to contact me. I want to thank the speakers today and for all those who attended the webinar. So with that.
Great. Thank you, Scott. I know we had a lot of questions come in throughout today's webinar, which is great. Definitely a great opportunity to ask your questions. I know we didn't get to every question, but hopefully the ones that we asked did address your questions, since we did have some familiar ones or come in. All the resources from today, the webinar and the presentation and a frequently asked questions or the Q&A document will be posted online in the near future, and we can send out an announcement once those are available. Thank you again to our speakers for addressing all the questions and giving kind of an overview of your program area. And with that, thank you.